Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I hope everybody is staying safe and cozy, and for those of you who are here, we're grateful that you're here. So last week, the CEO of United Healthcare, Brian Thompson, was murdered outside of his hotel in Midtown New York. For several days, the assailant, who is now in custody, was unknown and on the run. But what happened in the hours and the days after Mr. Thompson's death was astounding and honestly, truly horrifying. Because instead of mourning the death of a human being, a husband, a father, a son, a friend, people cheered. And they called this unknown assailant a hero. All because Mr. Thompson wasn't just a husband and a father, but also a healthcare executive. For those people taking to social media and cheering his death, Mr. Thompson has become a symbol of the broken healthcare system that we have here in America, a system that is supposed to heal people and care for the ill and ailing, but also turns profit for its investors. And so instead of anger or sadness at a man being killed in cold blood in broad daylight, people took to social media by storm. According to Nicholas Florko of The Atlantic, one post on X wishing that the murderer would never be caught racked up 95,000 likes. Social media was littered with jokes about Thompson's impending hospital bills and the tragedy of him not returning to his McMansion. The mood was summed up by the journalist Ken Klipperstein, who posted a chart on X showing that United Healthcare refuses to pay a larger percentage of users' healthcare bills than any other major insurer. Today, we remember the legacy of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson, he wrote. Ultimately, it seems to me that America has become embroiled in some really big moral and ethical dilemmas. We know that cold-blooded murder is wrong. It's against the law for one thing, and in case that's not enough, the Torah is pretty clear about it too. But for lots of folks engaging in this debate, they say there's a case to be made that it's not necessarily all that clear-cut. How many people have suffered or even died as a result of healthcare denials? How many people did not get life-saving medical care? How many people went without surgeries or medicine? As the CEO, the head of this organization that's arguably responsible for so much suffering, doesn't he bear some responsibility? And so people are left wondering, is there any justification for Mr. Thompson's death? Should he be held responsible for the actions of his company? As luck would have it, as it so often does when we look at Torah, this week's portion, Vayishlach, can provide a little bit of wisdom for us to think about as we grapple with these really big questions. Here in this Torah portion, we find a particularly painful episode in Torah. The feminist theologian Phyllis Tribble coined these types of passages texts of terror, which is an apt term for what we find here in this portion. On this Shabbat, we read about Jacob and Leah's daughter, Deana. We read about how Deana ventured outside of the camp. And it was then that Shechem, the son of the chief of the Hivite people, encountered Deana. The Torah is really terse in its words with what happens next. The verbs come in really rapid, quick succession. It says Shechem saw her, took her, lay with her, and defiled her. Now, there's no question that what happens in this episode is deeply painful and truly problematic. But as often happens in Torah, we're still left with questions, and we need clarity. On one hand, it is possible that what happened between Deana and Shechem was consensual, and the problem had more to do with the defilement of Deana because it diminishes her status and her standing as a young maiden. On the other hand, many commentators interpret this text as sexual assault and even rape. Regardless of which scenario is correct, and cases can and have been made for both, the important part for us is what happens next. Shechem's father approaches Jacob, Deana's father, to try and rectify the situation and create peace between their families. He asks for Deana's hand in marriage for his son Shechem. After some pretty tense negotiations, Shechem's father agrees to some really steep terms for the marriage. Every male in his nation would need to be circumcised. Then they too would be free to marry women in Jacob's camp. So before long, all of the men underwent circumcision. And here's where it gets interesting. On the third day, after all of the males were circumcised and they were still suffering in pain and in largely incapacitated states, Deana's brothers, Simeon and Levi, each took a sword, it says. They went undisturbed into the city and killed every male. They also killed Hamor and his son Shechem by the sword. Then, taking Deana from Shechem's house, they left. Jacob's other sons went over the slain and plundered the city, whose inhabitants had defiled their sister, taking their sheep, their cattle, and their donkeys, and all that was in the city and in the countryside. All of their wealth, their little ones, their wives, and all that was in their house, they seized as captives and as spoil. So we're left with an interesting question here. There was wrongdoing. Deana was defiled. So many of our commentaries and our texts acknowledge this assault and this violation. And if that's so, then how are we to interpret the actions of Deana's brothers? Were their actions in some way justifiable? They murdered every male in the city as retribution for the crimes committed against their sister. How are we to respond to this mass murder? Because they didn't just murder Shechem, the person responsible for violating Deana. They killed all of the men and took their wives as captives and plundered their possessions. Should we be horrified by this response? Should we be cheering at the violent downfall? It sounds a little bit similar to what we're talking about today. Maimonides, the Rambam, suggests that yes, the slaughter of the men was justified because they're all implicated in this serious crime because Shechem wasn't punished for his actions. A number of other commentaries also try to rationalize and justify her brother's actions to try to redeem our ancestors and redeem our texts. After all, Jacob's sons, our patriarchs, would only do what's righteous and good, right? But what if we're not supposed to redeem this text? What if Torah doesn't only teach us how to act, but also serves as a warning for us of what human beings are capable of? Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, a modern commentator, asks us to look at this text differently. Rabbi Hirsch writes, "Here begins the part of the story deserving of censure, and we do not need to cover it up." He goes on to suggest that we, the inheritors of the tradition, are under no obligation to find an excuse for this behavior. In other words, I wonder if the text exists to make us uncomfortable and to force us to question, to force us into these moral and ethical conversations about right and wrong, about how to respond when we or someone we love is hurt or suffering or has been violated. When we're hurt and we're angry, like Deana's brothers are, we of course in some way sympathize and even empathize with the enormity of their rage. We may even take a bit of pride in a family that is so close and loving that these brothers are driven to protect their sisters, to be those big brothers that shield her from pain. And at the same time, we also know that they murdered an entire city of people. They acted deceitfully and took advantage of men recovering from a surgery that they insisted on so that they would be weakened and incapacitated when they chose to strike. And they were murdered. They stole. They committed adultery. We simply can't cheer for that. There is no righteousness in that. There's no justification for the killing of innocent. Our Torah is quite clear about it. There are ways to deal with our anger, our suffering, and our pain. There are mechanisms by which a person can and should be punished and held accountable for their actions. The Torah asks us to grapple with these big questions. In this very portion, as Jacob approaches his brother Esau for the first time, after wronging him and essentially stealing his birthright and his blessing, he spends the night by the river and wrestles with an unnamed Ish, which we interpret often to mean an angel of God. And Jacob prevails. As a result of this struggle, he's given a new name, Yisrael, the one who wrestles with God. We, the Jewish people, are known as B'nai Yisrael, the people who wrestle with God. This is our inheritance. We are meant to be the people who wrestle with God, wrestle with our texts, wrestle with our narratives. The most beautiful thing about Judaism, I think, is that challenging conventional narratives of right and wrong is not only tolerated, but celebrated. We should be asking big questions about who is responsible for suffering and how we hold those responsible accountable. But Brian Thompson is not solely responsible. Our healthcare system is responsible because it's broken in our country. There are people suffering, unable to get medical, life-saving treatment, unable to have surgeries, or get medicine that they desperately need, people who are in financial ruin because of denied claims. We have a moral obligation to find a solution that puts the lives of human beings above profit margins. The Torah tells us that the mitzvah of pikuach nefesh, the saving of a life, is our highest priority. But cheering the cold-blooded murder of a singular person, even if that person is a CEO of a company, is not the way to fix a broken system. Certainly, human beings who are making decisions about the lives of other people bear some level of responsibility, but we do not hold them responsible by vigilante justice. We hold them responsible by electing officials who mirror our values, who want to fix our broken healthcare system. We lobby elected officials to change the amount of power insurance companies wield over our lives. We work hard to find solutions that save lives, not take them. It is fair to be angry. It is fair to be outraged. It's even fair to question who holds responsibility, even if it means holding that person accountable. It's fair to wonder what is right and what's wrong, and to wrestle with competing narratives and understandings. It's fair to believe that maybe Brian Thompson holds some responsibility for the decisions his company made. But we can't cheer his death, because we can't cheer murder. For as we learn soon enough, Pharaoh's armies will attempt to cross the sea, and God doesn't cheer when they drown, instead declaring to the angels, "My creations, my people are drowning in the sea, and you dare to rejoice in song before me?" So on this Shabbat, I want to invite all of us to wrestle and to discover new meanings in text, to not be afraid to engage in conversations because they help us to understand our traditions and our values in new ways that are wholly relevant to the world that we live in, because this is what Torah is for us and can be for us. It teaches us how to grapple with the world we live in right here today. It is today and every day the tree of life for those of us who hold fast to it. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.